Hello, my name is Matthew Abbott, and today I will be talking about Norse mythology and its relation to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So before we talk about any of that, let's talk about the creation of the universe according to the Norse. So to begin, there was the Gungap, the black, vast emptiness, nothingness. And from the Gungap came Muspelheim and Niflheim, fire and ice. Over time, the flames melted the ice and started to form the shape of a humanoid. That humanoid became Ymir, the first giant. And he had many descendants, and eventually the first three gods were born, three brothers, Odin, Vili, and Ve. They did not like that they were the only god and that there were many more giants than them, so they slayed Ymir and created everything that there is from his body. Ymir's blood became the rivers and the oceans, his hair the grass and trees, his teeth the rocks, his brains the clouds, his skull the sky, and so forth and so on. As they were creating everything from his body, some of the flesh started to rot, and from the rot came worms, and those worms became dwarves. Odin, Vili, and they were afraid that the skull over time would collapse and destroy the universe. So they tasked the dwarves with keeping the sky up, and from that they became great craftsmen and artificers. So that was kind of talk about the creation. Let's talk about Marvel's accuracy to the actual North legend. So we'll talk about the 9 realms first. The 9 realms are depicted very well in Marvel Universe. You have Asgard, you have Midgard, which is Earth, you have Muspelheim, Niflheim. It's all very accurate. We don't visit all of the realms, but they're shown there depicted in Yggdrasil, the World Tree. The really only main distinction between Norse and Marvel is that Yggdrasil in Marvel is depicted kind of more as a symbolic of the realms, but in Norse mythology, Yggdrasil is a massive literal tree. At the bottom of the roots is Hell, but here is Midgard, and then literally in the branches of the tree are the other realms, with Asgard just kind of there. But for the most part, it's very accurate. Let's talk about Thor now. Thor, attitude-wise, is very similar, but the only main distinction is his actual physical appearance. Thor was not golden hair. In fact, he had shaggy red hair like a mane almost. He was big, burly, and he rode across a cart pulled by rams, which is not seen in our universe. But for the most part, it's very accurate. Odin is another character there who is depicted all right. Odin is a god of war and poetry and all that. He's very well-rounded. But in the Marvel Universe, we see him more as a fatherly, loving vibe. We don't really see his warmongering side till the third Thor movie, but that's all fine. Overall, it's a very accurate depiction. Odin is Odin. Loki also stays very true. The character design is slightly different without, there's no helmet or anything, but the attitude and the mischievousness that he gets into in all of his spells and witchcraft is all very accurate. We just don't see all the tales that he gets involved in. It's just Loki as a character. Now let's talk about the 3 characters themselves in the actual Norse mythology. So I'll start off with Thor. Like as I mentioned, he was this big, burly Viking type guy, massive muscles. He was the defender of Asgard, the greatest weapon and the greatest shield, with red flowing hair. He's pulled by he rode across the sky in a chariot pulled by rams. He himself was the thunder god, and he had Mjolnir, which translates to lightning. So he was thunder and lightning, and he was just this warrior. But all kinds of shenanigans he gets into, my favorite of which is definitely Thor having to retrieve Mjolnir, which was stolen. He dresses up as a bride with he's like a massive burly Viking in a wedding gown and a veil and jewelry and everything, pretending to be this maiden who proceeds to eat a full ox and ate salmon and all of the food at the party and barrels of alcohol. And then at the end, when he finally retrieves Mjolnir, still dressed up in his wedding gown, he just smacks the head off this massive giant and kills everyone at the wedding party. And it's just this crazy tale of that craziness. Odin is great. Odin was the All-Father, but not quite what you'd imagine. In fact, to gain wisdom, he had to sacrifice his eye to the well of knowledge. He was a shaman, so he wanted to learn the runes. So he stabbed himself in the side and starved himself while he hung upside down from a tree, staring at the runes for 9 days and nights. And on the 9th night, he could comprehend the runes. But an interesting thing about shamans in Norse culture and mythology is that shamans practice sadir, which is basically fortune telling, but it's deeper than that. It's also like fate manipulation, basically. But for a male to practice Sadir was very feminine. In fact, to practice Sadir was to completely forsake your gender role as a man, as a masculinity, which is very interesting because Odin, the god of gods, the king of kings, a very epic character in his tales, was seen as a feminine kind of dude. Like, he was very muscular and looked masculine, but in the actual role he played in Norse society was very feminine, which is very interesting. And Loki is by far the most interesting character, but I'm not gonna talk about there's so many tales that he interjects himself into. Not only does he have his own individual tales, but he kind of mixes into all the tales that are out because he's very mischievous. In fact, a lot of the wrongdoings that happen in Norse mythology are caused by Loki, the god of mischief. So we'll talk about his 5 children, really. So we have the first 3 born from a giant. We have Hel, the goddess of death. We have Jormungand, the Midgard serpent, who is basically Thor's eternal rival. And then we have Fenrir, the giant wolf, who is destined to kill Odin and eat the moon. Very kind of tragic. But we have the 4th one, which is very funny. To save Asgard and his people, Loki has to shapeshift himself into a horse and then seduces another horse. He's a female horse who seduces a male horse to save Asgard. After saving the day, Loki disappears for 9 months and comes back in his human form, and there with him is his 8-legged horse child, who becomes the strongest and fastest horse in all of Midgard. Very, very tricky. His 5th son is, believe it or not, a completely normal child, just a god born from another god, his wife. So we have Nefir here, probably the most tragic out of the 5, because of all of his wrongdoings against the universe. Basically, the gods decide to punish Loki, so they kill his son right in front of him and bind Loki in a cave using his son's entrails and body as the chains that Loki can never break. He sits there with his head down like that, and poison drips on the back of his neck for all of eternity. And this is the most agonizing, painful thing ever. Just pure suffering of poison. His wife is there as well with a giant wooden bowl, and she catches the poison as it falls. But eventually, the bowl will fill up, and she has to dump it. In those brief few moments where she dumps it, the poison will hit the back of Loki's neck, and his screams will echo throughout the entire, all of the 9 realms, and it's very brutal. But that covers most of everything. Although there's a lot more, I would encourage you to dive into Norse mythology yourself and see what you can find, because it's very interesting.